For the next 23 minutes, we're going to be talking to Helen Zille about her life and her life in politics, which she has written about most engagingly in her just published autobiography, Not Without a Fight. She's coming to the studio. We have some listeners who've come in as well who are watching in an excited... Are they excited, Helen? I can't see them.
Well, they look excited. I hope I give them their money's worth.
They didn't pay, so you can... Yes. Just with reference to what has happened today, I was reminded of your quoting Francis Fukuyama, what needs to happen in countries in order for that country to get to Denmark, to that state of social cohesion and economic progress and equality which exists in Denmark. And what you need is the combination of a capable state, the rule of law, and a culture of accountability. And I think, I mean, for me, what happened today shows that we have none of those things. We're not even close.
There are different signs every day in South Africa. What is happening now, I think, is just another attempt to protect the real crooks by finding charges against people who are trying to keep the country honest. And lots of people have been down that road before. You'll remember that Thuli Madonsela was accused of being a CIA agent. And I think anybody who stands up to corruption and power abuse finds that they are subject to a fishing expedition to trawl through every aspect of their lives to see if the powers that be can find something against them. And it's very interesting that the pattern is usually the same. The first charge is one related in one way or another to spying, because spying is such a nebulous and unspecific allegation, and it sounds so devious and underhand. So as you will see in my book, I've been accused of being involved in spying several times. And then the next way to take things forward is usually by another charge, which often is fraud, because they will find something, for example, in this case, like Pravin Gordhan allowing one of his colleagues, Mr. Pillay, to take early retirement and then rehiring him as a case of fraud, and they were going to have to make it out to be very serious. Now, these charges do sound very serious, but often when you scratch the surface, they are nothing of the kind. And I wrote a newsletter at the time, this all burst at the end of 2014, where I said this is a massive diversion from the fact that the South African Revenue Service was going after politically connected people to find out why they were evading tax. And I'm still absolutely sure that's the case. They got far too close to Jacob Zuma, and these charges, whether they have any basis in fact or not, are designed to pull a smokescreen over the real crooks in South Africa.
To the book, when one is setting out to write about a life which has been as rich, as textured as yours has been, with so much involved, even though the book is fairly sizable, 500-odd pages, and let me just say that it's a page-turner. Don't be scared by the heft of the book. It is compulsively readable from the beginning to the end. You have to decide what's going to be the balance between your private life and your public life, and what aspects of your public life you're going to concentrate on, because your public life, through your work with UCT, through your work with Grove Primary and that issue, and then your involvement in politics, there's no way that you can go into all of that. How did you think about your life and what I'm going to tell people about it?
Well, first of all, I decided to do it chronologically, and then it wrote itself. I decided to have a chapter on my background and where I come from. And
very short, 34 pages takes us from birth to the end of your matric at St. Mary's.
Correct.
Just 34 pages.
Yes, but I wrote that, and it was all the important things. What my career as a journalist really taught me to do was to be able to pick the eyes out of a situation, to be able to say, that's important, that's going to be relevant later on, this is significant, this is insignificant. This is the balance between the humour and the serious parts. And it just chose itself almost. I wrote each chapter one after the other, and eventually there it was.
What publicity there has been has focused on, if you like, the airing of dirty linen. You might see it slightly differently. The contretemps with Lindiwe Mazibuko, the gap that opened despite your very public championing of her right to lead the DA in Parliament, the issues around Mampela Rampila. and quite extraordinary. I mean, this is the thing about politics in this country, Helen, is that so much happens that you forget. I mean, reading your extensive chapter on those incredibly internecine Byzantine stuff that was happening when we were trying to form coalitions, and coalitions were forming and breaking down, and Buddy Chaban and Kent Morkel and all that stuff. Well, you kind of go, yeah, that happened, and it's only 10 years ago that this was happening, and so much has happened since then.
Well, it was only 10 years ago, but unearthing what really happened at the time was fascinating. For example, at the time we didn't know that Kent Morkel was working with Buddy Chaban behind the scenes. And Kent Morkel's job was to bring enough floor crossers from the Democratic Alliance, and Buddy Chaban's job was to bring enough floor crossers from the Independent Democrats to collapse our government and put the ANC back into power, with Kent Morkel as the mayor, Buddy Chaban as the deputy mayor, to make the procurement system, and especially the property holdings of the city, an extension of their network. And let me dare say it, many people would perceive it to be an underground and corrupt network. And that was the intention, and we really had to fight back against that. So it's touch and go on these issues, and it does read like a thriller to me. I kept all the papers at the time.
It was extraordinary.
Yes.
Really. I mean, you were telling me things that I should have known, but I didn't know, and you were telling me things that I could not have known because you didn't know them at the time.
Well, I didn't know them at the time. I mean, it was very interesting for me to go through a transcript of one of the tapes and suddenly find Buddy Chaban talking about his business relationship and political relationship with Kent Morkel, who at that stage was the DA's chair in the Western Cape and who was involved in all of our strategizing to keep Buddy Chaban's bribery strategy at bay. And yet there he was doing business with Buddy Chaban while being part of our inner circle and our strategy. So you can imagine what was going on there. It makes House of Cards look pale.
Yeah, you make that reference several times. I'm going to go on to some of the other elements of your political life, but your personal life. I mean, you quote at one stage, you quote Koos Becker as saying to you, be honest about everything except about your children. Tell the truth about everything except about your children. And it's not a criticism, it's a personal preference. I would have liked to have had more of Helen Zille, the mother, Helen Zille, the daughter, Helen Zille, the wife, Helen Zille, the friend, because you write so charmingly and with such love and humour about your family. But then there are these, you confessed to anorexia when in your first and only year at UCT, and we have up in the studio a photograph of Helen Zille as a drum motorette, which is an extraordinary thing. You write briefly but very tellingly about the 2 severe postpartum depressions that you had following the birth of your 2 boys. Was there an internal pressure to write more or write less about those things about which nobody has known, well, very few people have known until you put them on the pages of the book?
No, there wasn't really. As I wrote the book chronologically, the strands just wove together. It's like taking long hair and plaiting it and just taking one strand of this and one strand of that and the third strand, and that's how it just wove together. I had to work out how much I would write about my sons, and in the end I thought, they've got lives to lead. They're young adults and they're doing their thing, I'm very grateful to say, and being productive members of society, and one day they must write their own stories. I wrote about their childhood and all the fun and the challenges we had during their childhood, but I'll let them write the story of their development into adults and their future in that road. So that I held back on, and I think it was right to do that. No young person wants the perceptions of them to be shaped by their parents, and probably I would write an over-rosy picture of my children because that's just who I am. So, but nevertheless, it just wrote itself, is all I can say. In every chapter, I just knew which things to put in and which not to put in. For some people, they would want more of the family, more of the personal, and other people would skip that out and want more of the politics. So I try to get the balance right.
Do you see it as airing dirty linen in public? I mean, during that time of the political manoeuvrings here in the Western Cape, you feel that Tony Leon and the national leadership of the DA weren't on your side enough. They were so concerned about keeping the NNP members on board at a national level that they, you don't say it in these words, but essentially they threw you to the wolves. And you were quite critical of the way Lindiwe Mazibuko formed a tight team around her and blocked access by you to her and what was happening in Parliament. You're very critical of Mampela Rampele and that whole saga. Is that the way you see it, dirty linen?
No, I don't see it as dirty linen. I see it as trying to set out what happened. And very few people from the outside can see exactly what is happening inside politics, which is a very complex space. And I hope that even telling the story from my perspective, and there's no doubt about that, I hope that I've been fair and balanced and reflected my understanding of where the other people in the drama were coming from. So, for example, with Tony Leon, it was his vision, primarily, which I supported, to consolidate the opposition and to merge the DP with the NNP at the time. His legacy would have been in tatters had that blown apart twice. It did on the first occasion when Martinus van Schalkwyk walked out of the Democratic Alliance in 2001. And obviously after that, Tony was desperate not to allow it to happen again. And the people who wanted to hijack the DA as a form of racial nationalism in the Western Cape understood Tony's concerns very, very well and played on them quite ruthlessly. And Tony, if he wanted to keep the party together, had to make sure that they stayed on board and had to make sacrifices in order to do that. I, on the other hand, perceived it through the lens of our party being effectively hijacked by those who had not made the transition from racial nationalism yet. And the Western Cape was the only province we could govern. And to have that province under a form of racial nationalism and patronage politics was something I wasn't prepared to allow. And there were many other people who weren't prepared to allow it. And so I'm afraid it was a deep divide in the party, which for a while was a fault line between me and Tony. That is true. But I understand exactly where he was coming from and why he was in that position at the time. He didn't want the party to go back to the 1.7% we had been in 1994. But I felt there was no point in becoming a huge party of government unless we stood for something and protected that something.
We haven't really talked much, and you talk about it in the book, and that's where people will get all the information about your own personal development. I mean, you came out of a household which was politically aware. There was a DA at that stage, I think a PFP or PP involvement in your early days, but then you moved considerably more to the left. And at one point you say, I was not an ANC member, but I was a very solid ANC supporter. You were working with the End Conscription campaign and so on. You and Johan, your husband, offered your cottage at the bottom of the garden to activists. You deliberately kept yourselves in the dark as to exactly what was happening, and what was happening was with people like Tony Yengeni and Chris Giffard and others who were potentially on trial for treason were being sheltered in that house. And then there's this incredibly strong identification with the DA. And at times you say things like, I really didn't agree with the fight back slogan, and.
Well, I'll tell you really what happened. I did move very close to the ANC and was involved in many of the organizations that were part of building the ANC internally when it was still banned, yes. I also saw very much and at close quarters two streaks in the ANC that I really didn't like. One was a very strong reversion to racial nationalism, and the other was a very strong Marxist strand. And I'm definitely not a Marxist because I think it can only result in tyranny. And I'm definitely not a racial nationalist. So the big challenge was, can liberals find a space? Non-racial liberals find a space in the ANC? And my conclusion progressively was no. And then at the beginning of the 1990s, when we went through the transition and we had CODESA, I was asked by Ken Andrew of the DP to come and back up Working Group 3 at CODESA, and I did go, and I found that fascinating. And I saw what a critical role the DP was, in fact, playing in formulating the constitution behind the scenes. It was a very powerful role, and a lot of the intellectual firepower was coming from there. And then when we had our first democratic election in 1994, my husband and I had simply assumed we would be voting for the ANC up till that point. But I'd realized by then that the biggest challenge of our new democracy was that the ANC would become too powerful. And what we critically needed from the beginning was checks and balances on too much power being concentrated in too few hands. And that is why in the first election I said to my husband, I'm voting for the DP. And he said...
he was very surprised, wasn't he?
He was very surprised.
He thought it was a done deal that the two of you would be voting for the ANC.
Yes, absolutely. He was more than surprised. I think he was quite shocked. Nevertheless, I said, there's no doubt that the ANC is going to win and should win. No doubt about that. But the big question is there going to be a strong, principled, non-racial opposition? And I couldn't vote for the NNP, obviously. So I decided to vote for the DP. And then after that, I realized more and more that we needed a strong opposition, especially in my years at the Grove Primary School and this distortion of the South African Schools Act for the ANC's purposes.
One of the many fascinating chapters in the book, and you don't have particularly high regard for the media. That is clear on just about every page of the book. And one of the periods where I felt ashamed at what a poor job I had done was I should have known, and people like me should have known more about the difficulty of the DA trying to set up branches in the townships in Cape Town. You go into that in some detail, the level of intimidation and the lack of support from police and the deep, abiding, daily danger, day and night, that those few people who are aligning themselves with the DA had to go through.
Yes, I frankly think that is the most powerful chapter because it's all true and it all comes straight from our files and records. It was quite extraordinary. And we owe an enormous debt of gratitude to the young pioneers as they were at the stage. They're not all that young anymore, who had the guts to stand up and have their houses broken down, have their houses burnt out. One woman even lost her children in the process. It was an horrific period because it showed just how the hegemony of the ANC brooked no alternative. And the police went from the point of departure that it was ANC territory and the DA was just asking for trouble to come in there and organize. At that stage, I did try to hold a few press conferences, and I still have the press statements in which I set that out. But I don't think many people today understand how the ANC completely dominated the moral high ground at that stage of our politics. They symbolized democracy, they symbolized all that was great and good, and the DP symbolized something that journalists didn't want to associate with because they needed to be progressive and avant-garde. And in the early 2000s, they were trying to act as though it was still brave to side with the ANC, whereas it had been in the 1980s was no longer brave. They were about 20 years behind the times, but they'd caught up.
I told you didn't like the media.
Well, I can't say that I don't see the media as a homogenous block. I don't generalize about any category of people, and certainly I don't generalize about the media. There are good journalists, there are bad journalists. But I can tell you as a fact that in those days when I called press conferences and spelt that out and brought some of the victims of violence there, it just got no traction at all.
Okay. Guilty as charged. Mampela, you are harshest. You're harsh on yourself because you say it's the biggest political mistake you ever made and you accept full responsibility for it. But you're also, and you are somebody who I doubt that you admire anywhere near as much now as you did when you worked for her at UCT. You found her not easy to work for, but there was a great deal of admiration and respect, and that's why you wanted her as part of the DA. But, it's the second last meeting you had with her before the final announcement that the Agang DA marriage was off, refer to her black neck dress and her red nails and her cloud of Oscar de la Renta perfume. I think you're still, at the time that you were writing the chapter, very aggrieved about that.
Look, I've always known that Mampela isn't easy. She's a tough taskmaster. And I've always known that she needs strong people to work with. If you have a thin skin or if you are easily affronted, you mustn't work with Mampela. What I didn't know about her was that she would chop and change her position so regularly and that she wouldn't understand the implications of that for the greater political context. And so it was very, very, very difficult. And every time she came back to try and start things afresh, I'd go back in good faith, and then the whole thing would blow up again. And it went on for literally 3.5 years.
And she did it because she wanted money, you say?
No, she didn't go into politics because she wanted money.
But she approached the DA because by starting a gang, she developed debts which were becoming ever more burdensome, and saw her link up with the DA as being primarily, you suggest, a way of relieving that debt burden, rather than something which was politically or ideologically motivated.
Well, at that point it had become that. But when she first approached me in 2011, after we'd worked so hard together to merge the DA and the Independent Democrats, when that had happened, she came to me after our very good local government election results in 2011 and said, I'm now ready to join the DA. And at that point she was going to join just like that, and we were going to build the DA, relaunch the DA, rebrand the DA, and do all sorts of things. Then she dropped back from that. Then she came back. Then she dropped back from that. Then she decided to start a gang. Then she couldn't make it viable. Then she came back again. So I've explained every step of the way in the book in a engaging narrative, or I hope it's an engaging narrative, to tell people what happened and why. And in the end, it just blew apart.
And we don't have terribly long. We have to talk about Helen Zille and social media, Helen Zille and Twitter. Are you still as active?
Yes, I'm very active. I'm very active. No one puts me off doing things. I mean, a few controversies don't put me off.
Is that something you regret at all? I mean, in the book it's quite clear that economic refugee comment, which got you into a lot of
educational
refugees, which got you into a lot of social media hot water. You don't regret that at all. You still maintain that you were completely and utterly misunderstood, and that your point was valid.
I did apologize about it at the time. I did. Because I could understand why, to some people, that might be taken as a perception that people didn't belong here. Now, that is not what I meant at all. And having my own parents as refugees, I never ever saw it as a slight or anything bad. If anything, the use of the word refugee is an indictment of the people who govern the place you have to flee from. And if you look at schools in the Eastern Cape, you understand why so many learners want to study in the Western Cape and come to schools in the Western Cape. That was the simple point I was trying to make. And the great irony of that was I was trying to show how much we are doing for learners coming from the Eastern Cape rather than saying they weren't welcome. But you see, you've got to understand that there are trolls on Twitter who look for every possible thing about which they can feel aggrieved and which they can manufacture some outrage around. And we mustn't get too influenced by it, because we were new to Twitter as a country. People started giving it inflated perceptions. And as one editor said after the last election, I can see now Twitter isn't the electorate. And it isn't. And we must stop pretending that it is.
And there we will leave it. Helen Zille, author of her autobiography, Not Without a Fight. Thank you very, very much for coming in. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, John.